If you are someone who consumes animosity and misery for breakfast, then bad news for you because Elon Musk has announced Saturday that Twitter would temporarily restrict how many tweets users could read per day in a movement to tamp down on the use of the site's data by artificial intelligence companies. So, what exactly are the limitations that good old Elon is going to impose on his platform? So, firstly, for verified accounts, meaning that you have the blue checkmark and you've subscribed to Twitter Blue, then you are entitled to 10,000 tweets per day. Otherwise, if you have an unverified account, meaning that you are a filthy normie who did not subscribe to Twitter Blue and you don't have the precious blue checkmark, then you are only entitled to 1,000 tweets per day. Now, at the bottom of the caste system, for new and unverified accounts, you are only entitled to 500 tweets per day. So it's actually kind of funny that Elon is now posing as the one-man army PR of Twitter right now, considering the official Twitter account has announced nothing regarding this situation. Literally, the last tweet was made on May 13, and it was just about some updates on the monetization policies, but literally nothing about this huge change that could affect the future of the website if Elon doesn't do his job properly. And if you think that Elon is doing a professional job at doing damage control right now, considering he's like one of the richest guys in the world, a supposedly very good businessman, then unfortunately you're wrong because Elon is just continuing playing meme lord in the situation, and the best that he can do is to just write this masterpiece of a poem. You awake from a deep trance, step away from the phone to see your friends and family. if Elon's idea of damage control is to literally just make fun of his Twitter users, then that just further proves that he is one of the dumbest billionaires out there, if not the dumbest. Now, interestingly, Jack Dorsey, the OG founder of Twitter, responded to this entire situation by saying, "Running Twitter is hard. I don't wish that stress upon anyone. I trust that the team is doing their best under the constraints they have, which are immense. It's easy to critique the decisions from afar, which I'm guilty of, but I know the goal is to see Twitter thrive, and it will." So one Twitter user responded here by saying, "Twitter is the only decent social app of..." Okay. We have to stop the opinion right there. And I hate that Jack even agrees with this shit. Look, it only takes a few seconds of sunlight to know that Twitter is not a decent social media app, let alone the only decent social media app. Heck, I would wager that Twitter is like the bottom of the barrel when it comes to the entire stack of social media apps out there. And again, it's surprising that it's coming from Jack. He even agrees with this sentiment, considering that Jack has literally seen how Twitter, his very own baby, sank into the bottom of hell ever since 2006. Now let's talk about data collection, because this is the main reason that Elon cites as why Twitter is imposing these rate limitations. For some context, models like ChatGPT, Midjourney rely on large amounts of internet data in order to power their functions, in order to make them effective. The reason why ChatGPT is so good at writing essays and in general answering the questions that you ask it is because its outputs are dependent on real life internet data. Now, the thing is, it's kind of unclear how ChatGPT specifically gets its data. The best that we have is just this article bulletizing some ways how ChatGPT gets its data. So there's web scraping, user feedback, knowledge databases, social media, and open source datasets. But there really isn't a white paper that gives technical explanations on how ChatGPT specifically garners its data. We're going to focus on two methods here, which is web scraping and social media, which is actually API usage. Now, fundamentally, web scraping is the extraction of data from websites using HTML pages that you collect from the browser. Now, this is essentially how it works. Whenever you go to a browser and you enter a website, let's say youtube.com, what you were doing is that you were essentially going out to the internet and sending a GET request saying that, hey, I want to get the web page of youtube.com because I want to view some videos. So what happens then is that a server, let's say Google service, receives this request and then it says, oh, you want youtube.com. So what it's going to give to you in return is the web page in the form of an HTML file containing the contents of youtube.com. So when your browser receives that web page, that HTML file, it then does the legwork in rendering that onto your monitor. It does the job of rendering the thumbnails, rendering your subscriptions list, your profile picture, and all those kinds of stuff. Now, the thing is, the HTML page, the HTML file, pretty much contains everything you see on your monitor. Now, if you go to your browser right now and you go right click and click on inspect element, you can see the actual HTML file, and you'll see that pretty much any text that you see on the web page that you're viewing can also be seen in the HTML file, because that's what the web page is basing off of. And now the thing that web scrapers do is that, they take these HTML files and then they scrape as much information as they can from that HTML file, and they collate that into one neat human readable format. Now, the thing about web scraping tools is that they are actually free, or at least very cheap, depending on the tools that you use. But generally, web scraping tools are like the most accessible ways to garner large amounts of internet data. Now, the counterpart to this is using an API, or an application programming interface. And essentially, you can imagine this as executing code, specialized code that directly communicates with the data source. So, in particular, let's say the Twitter API, right? What I'm doing when I'm using the Twitter API is that I'm using code, specialized code from Twitter themselves, so that I can communicate with their servers directly and get more specific information that web scrapers do not have the ability to. So as an example, Twitter's API allows you to do complex queries like pulling every tweet about a certain topic within the last 20 minutes, or pull a certain user's non-retweeted tweets. Generally, with API usage, it is much more expensive because you are essentially paying for a service from the actual source of the data. Regardless if you're using web scraping tools or if you're using API calls, both of them can consume network resources from Twitter's backend. And if you employ them at such a large scale, then yes, it does become a possibility that you are leaving out actual human users, users that can actually give money to the platform. So I do understand why Musk had to implement these kinds of limitations, because yes, it is very expensive to maintain a large network infrastructure as large as Twitter, especially when said infrastructure is being stressed 24/7 by AI models that are constantly trying to build training datasets. But at the end of the day, I still want to hear from Musk like some explanation, some more detailed explanation as to how exactly these AI models and their data scraping techniques are negatively affecting Twitter's backend, as a whole. Now, personally, I think these limitations, to cut costs, isn't just because of AI. Because the reality is, Twitter is also suffering from a large amount of rising debt from their cloud service providers. So if you don't know what a cloud is, think of it as like a group of very powerful computers that are specialized to do large scale functions in the internet. So for example, you have mass storage services such as Dropbox, Google Drive, Microsoft OneDrive, and Apple's iCloud. But the cloud can also be used as network infrastructure for very large websites, such as Twitter, Twitch, YouTube, and a lot more social media platforms out there. Now, the reality is, setting up your own servers and your own data centers is a very expensive endeavor. You need to have a lot of capital for that kind of stuff, which is why we have companies like Amazon Web Services, otherwise known as AWS, and Google Cloud that already provide cloud infrastructure for you for a fee. Now, Twitter has signed contracts with both Google and AWS for cloud infrastructure. The first one is Google Cloud. In 2018, Twitter signed a $1 billion contract with Google to host some of its services on the company's Google Cloud. This is the reason why on Twitter you can sign in via your Gmail account. But more importantly, this is also the reason why Twitter is safe from child sexual abuse material, otherwise known as CSAM. Because built into Google's cloud infrastructure are anti-CSAM mechanisms that protect their client websites from that kind of content. And it's pretty bad that apparently Twitter has refused to pay Google ahead of the June 30 deadline. Now imagine if Twitter fails to pay Google and Google ends up terminating that contract. You can imagine that Twitter will lose probably a large chunk of their network infrastructure, but more importantly, lose a lot of those important moderation features, like those anti-CSAM mechanisms that I've mentioned, which keep their website legally safe. So as of June 21, Twitter has actually resumed paying Google Cloud, but I still think that the fact that they were adamantly refusing to pay in the first place was still a dick move on Twitter's part, especially since I've mentioned that Google Cloud hosts some pretty important moderation mechanisms that ensure that Twitter is a safe space. Now, it's not just Google that's the problem. They're also having a problem with AWS. So, AWS is much more recent in Twitter's infrastructure history. They got into a contract back in 2020, but now, apparently, according to an article from The Information, there is at least 70 million US dollars still outstanding from Twitter, and AWS is rightfully pissed. AWS is not willing to renegotiate the 5.5 year contract it signed with Twitter in 2020. So Elon and Twitter are in a pretty dark place right now, and the best that we can hope for is that this restriction will only be for a couple of days, or maybe a couple of weeks, or at most a couple of months. But hopefully it won't be something permanent, because if so, then that will literally spell the death of Twitter as we know it. And more importantly, that will spell the death of the $44 billion that Elon wasted into buying Twitter. And well, you know what? Elon should have just invested that 44 billion into a goddamn submarine.